Hi everyone, before we begin I just want to say this video was uploaded last week and it got age restricted straight away. I can't really tell why because it doesn't seem that graphic to me, but I guess YouTube have their reasons and so be it. Apparently if you want to watch an age restricted video, YouTube are now asking people to scan their passports or show some other form of ID, which seems a bit dodgy to me. So what I've tried to do is go through the video and pick out any bits that might have fell foul of the rules. The audio is still exactly the same, but in some places there'll be a little yellow sticker covering over some of the visuals. If you'd like to watch the video completely uncut, I will put a link down below to the Odyssey version. If you want to stay on YouTube, then it's pretty much the same video, it's just got a little yellow sticker over the top of some bits, and enjoy. Hello everybody. Shrouded Hand here. If you're anything like me, then most of your search history involves looking up torture methods, and you're definitely on some sort of government watch list. You'll probably also notice that every article about history's most brutal torture methods always has the same things listed over and over again. Have you heard of the Brazen Bull? Yes, everybody has. So I'm going to take a look at some of the more obscure torture methods from history, ones that don't appear in every other list on the internet. I'm not saying that these will all be completely new to you, but at least you won't be hearing about the Iron Maiden for the millionth time. I'll begin with a punishment known as the Swedish Drink, or Sweden Drink. It's similar to a more well-known torture called the water cure. The water cure has been used by various regimes all over the world since at least the 14th century. The victim is restrained and their nose is covered. Then, with the aid of a funnel or a hose, a large quantity of water is forced into their stomach. Because the liquid can't be compressed, the stomach and intestines of the victim expand painfully to hold the water. And when the belly fills up to bursting limit, the water begins to flow back up the victim's throat, filling the nose and the mouth, producing a suffocating, drowning sensation. Sometimes the torturer will stamp on the victim's stomach, forcing the water back up and damaging the diaphragm. During the 30 Years' War, Swedish troops in the south of Germany took this punishment to a whole new level. Instead of water, they force-fed their prisoners raw sewage. They used whatever disgusting substances they could get their hands on: animal and human feces, urine, vomit, blood and rotting meat. Not only did the victim have to endure the suffocating torture of being half drowned and the painful bloating as their internal organs expanded to bursting points, but also the nauseating disgust of being forced to consume waste matter in huge quantities. And that's not to mention the horror of whatever diseases the victim caught if they managed to survive the ordeal. A particularly nasty variation of this torture was to heat the liquid to scalding temperatures before pouring it down the victim's throat, boiling their internal organs from the inside out. And it wasn't just 17th century Swedes that practiced this torture. There are similar reports from certain re-education camps in modern day China. Prison guards brutally force-feeding prisoners that refuse to eat. Sometimes they'll use salt water, high-strength alcohol, chili sauce, cleaning products and human waste to increase their torment. Another disturbing variation of the water cure is the rice torture, reportedly carried out by Japanese military police on prisoners of war during World War II. Before water is forced down the victim's throat, they would be fed a large quantity of uncooked rice. A hose would then be forced down the throat and the stomach filled with water till it was agonizingly distended. The rice in the stomach would absorb the water and expand. The victim would be left in this painful predicament for several days as the rice digested. Such a huge quantity of uncooked and probably dirty rice passing slowly through the prisoner's digestive system would cause internal bleeding. And speaking of bizarre variations of a well-known torture, I'm sure a lot of you are already aware of the Spanish horse, a wooden triangular beam which the victim is forced to sit on. Sometimes weights are placed onto their legs. They're left in this position for many hours and possibly days, and it causes great pain and damage to the groin area. Well, in ancient China, they had a device that makes the Spanish horse look like a pony ride. This device was known as the wooden donkey. Although there are some records of it being used on men, it was mostly used on women who were accused of prostitution, adultery, or of killing their husbands. In its most simple form, it was a straight wooden beam which the woman was forced to straddle whilst two people carried the beam through the streets in a humiliating parade. What made this device different to the usual Spanish horse torture was a short phallic wooden pole that stuck up from the middle of the beam. As the woman had to sit naked on the wooden donkey, you can imagine what orifice the pole went into. The motion of the wooden donkey and the weight of her body pushing down on the upright pole would start out as an embarrassing discomfort and would soon become agonizingly painful. She would be paraded around like this for 3 hours. Sometimes the parade would end with the woman being publicly executed. Sometimes long iron nails were hammered through the woman's thighs to keep her from falling off the donkey or moving to a more comfortable position. There are many variations of the wooden donkey torture. Some are more mechanically impressive than others. Some looked more like a classic rocking horse with the upright pole attached to some sort of axle that made it move independently of the donkey. Anyone familiar with the exercise bike in Always Sunny might have an idea of how this worked. Prolonged hours on the device would cause serious internal damage. An even worse variant was the Iron Lotus. Instead of a phallic upright pole, the woman would be forced to sit on a metal object shaped like a lotus bulb. When the interrogator pulled on the donkey's tail, the lotus bulb would open up inside the woman and rotate painfully. I can't find any images of the Iron Lotus, but it sounds very similar to another medieval torture device called the Pear of Anguish. Here's another brutal version of the wooden donkey, which simply uses spikes along its back. And possibly the worst version of the wooden donkey did away with the donkey entirely. Instead, they just had an upright pole much taller than the victim. She would be suspended in the air and slowly lowered down onto it, and then she would be left like that, her entire body weight supported by the pole inside her. Over many hours, gravity would force the pole deeper and deeper, eventually penetrating her internal organs. In some reports, the woman would be left on the pole until it emerged from her mouth. Whilst I was looking for weird tortures, I found this picture in a book. The man in the picture is called John Costos, and he's being tortured by the Inquisition. I don't know if the device has a name, and I haven't heard it mentioned anywhere else except in The Torture of John Costos. Costos was an 18th century Freemason who founded the Masonic Lodge in Lisbon. In March of 1743, he was arrested and thrown into a dungeon at Lisbon's prison of the Inquisition. They tried to get him to divulge Masonic secrets, and when he refused, he was escorted to the torture chamber. The first torture was to lie him down on a frame and tie thin ropes around his arms and thighs. The ropes passed underneath him through holes in the frame, and they were pulled tight, cutting through his flesh. This torture was repeated multiple times until the ropes had sliced him down to the bone. After that, he was sent back to solitary confinement in the dungeon. 6 weeks later, they dragged him into the torture chamber once more. This time they made him stand with his arms stretched out to his sides and his palms facing forwards. Ropes were tied around his wrists and his arms were pulled behind him using a pulley until the backs of his hands touched together. This caused his shoulders to dislocate and blood to pour from his mouth. The torture was repeated 3 more times before he was once again sent back to the dungeon. prison surgeons managed to set his shoulders back into their sockets, and he was left in solitary for another 2 months to recover. When he was once again brought to the torture chamber, this was the device they employed. He was placed with his back against a thick board of wood. A heavy chain was wrapped around his torso twice, then his arms were stretched out and his wrists were attached to each end of the chain. The ends of the chains were attached to ropes, and these ropes were fed through a pulley system at either side of the board. By pulling the ropes, the chain was pulled tight around John Kostos' torso. It started crushing his internal organs, cracking ribs and making it impossible to draw breath to scream. At the same time that the chain tightened around his body, it also pulled his arms outwards until his wrists and shoulders dislocated. After the torture was repeated 3 times, his limbs were pushed back into their sockets by the prison surgeons, and he was led back to the dungeons. He was unable to lift his hands to feed himself for many weeks afterwards. A month later, a British ambassador to Lisbon intervened and had him released. He moved to England and wrote a book about his experiences. This diabolical reinvention of the rack is interesting because of its rarity. Looking at other versions of the rack brings up very little variation. The rack has been used for centuries by a multitude of regimes, and yet when I look for different versions, it's very hard to find anything that deviates from the basic design. It's the same with other tortures. Waterboarding, for example, that favourite of modern day interrogators in Guantanamo Bay, and it was done in exactly the same way in the 1500s by the Spanish Inquisition. When it comes to human suffering, it seems that torturers found out what worked early on and they've stuck with these methods ever since. It was only the discovery of electricity that added any real innovation to our ability to inflict pain on one another. And that's what I found interesting about these unusual torture methods, not just the cruelty of them, but how rare they are to find. Anyway, I might continue this topic in future videos. I do have a whole list of weird tortures that I could go through if this is something that interests people. So let me know what you think in the comments and give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Big thanks to the channel supporters, it's much appreciated. Thanks for keeping the channel going. So here's some more videos for you to check out if you're one of those strange people that likes this sort of thing. Thanks for watching. Until next time, goodbye.